Morning, everyone, and happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about Google's hiring process demystified. Today we have a packed session and we'll cover a ton of information, starting from how you could get discovered by Google recruiters, all the way through how leveling works and how team match works at Google. So we have a ton of stuff to cover. If you are joining us this morning, please start out by saying hello to everyone in the chat window at the very right. That also helps me know that you could hear me, which is a very big plus. And please tell us where you're from. Always love to see where folks are joining us from. I'm joining from San Francisco this morning. The way that this office hour of What Candor works is this is part of a series of different topics we're covering to help folks get hired. And today we're covering Google. Tomorrow we're talking about Amazon. And on Monday, we're talking about Facebook and how to become a product manager at Facebook. Today's workshop is meant to be fairly high level, so we'll cover how the mechanics of getting hired at Google work for all roles. And then we'll have deep dives into specific roles starting next week. So we'll talk about things specific to engineers or specific to product managers or specific to designers or other roles. So this is kind of part of a series, and if you've had a chance to attend this kind of intro one, you'll be invited for the future ones as well. All right, let's kick it off. Make sure you're in a comfortable spot. Make sure you have something to write with. You have your glass of water. I'm not recording the session today, so feel free to ask any and all questions, whatever they might be. Happy to help you out. And I will send notes and resources and add all sorts of helpful stuff as we go along in the handout section. Since we won't be able to stop in every area and spend a ton of time there, instead, I've prepared a good amount of handouts for you to sort of spend time reading afterwards, almost as homework after the session. All right, let's kick it off. A little bit about Candor. Candor does salary negotiation for high-skilled professionals, and the way that it works is you don't pay us anything unless we increase your offer. Discretion is super important to us, so we work under NDA, and we've helped hundreds and hundreds of people negotiate their offers and get better outcomes, especially at companies like Google, Stripe, Facebook, Amazon, and Airbnb. Most of our clients get $50K more on their offer, and a lot get more than that as well because we work with folks all the way up to C-level executive level. So from entry level all the way up to there, and so everybody's increase will vary based on their level and their circumstances as well. Some resources we have for you. The job market right now is really intense. And obviously, a lot of you are seeing this as well. A lot of the job listings out there are unfortunately not real. Some companies haven't been able to update their job listings after COVID. Some are hopeful that things will go back to normal and they haven't made changes. Regardless, we don't want you applying for jobs that don't exist, so we crowdsourced a list of what's happening on the market. So you could use this, it's totally free, and there's a ton of functionality there, so you could filter by location, by company, by industry, by size of the company, and then you'll have some notes from the community there, from recruiters, and links on the job post as well. And if you have done this already, or if you've applied for a ton of jobs and you're having a little bit of trouble, we also started what's called a sourcing list. And we'll talk about sourcing a bit today, but it's essentially recruiters applying to you versus you going to recruiters. And recruiters do this all the time. Most sourcing happens through LinkedIn. So this is kind of a proxy, and we have recruiters from companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and a ton of companies that are from the latest YC batch as well. So if you are looking for a tech job, we have about 450 recruiters on there now, which is kind of nuts. And people will reach out to you actively if they're interested in your background. So you could put together like a small profile to put on there with your LinkedIn, all of your information. And if you have some trouble with like your resume, your LinkedIn, just pop into one of the office hours and we'll give you a ton of tips on how to do that right. And we have some office hours upcoming. I mentioned we have Amazon coming up. On Friday, we're also talking about building a personal brand, which is super important to getting top tier compensation, so getting paid competitively, and also for being discovered during sourcing by recruiters. And then on Monday, we're going to talk about how to become a product manager at Facebook. And I'll post next week's schedule tomorrow. I'm so excited to show you how many new topics we have coming up as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So I wanted to give you kind of a sneak peek of what we might talk about today because we have so much content coming up. So some things that we'll chat about is, first of all, why people with even like 10 years or more of experience routinely don't get hired by Google. In fact, it's actually more likely that you won't get hired if you have that many years of experience versus if you don't. So we're going to really unpack that and understand what Google looks for in your resume, in your background, in your previous projects. Another thing we'll talk about is reaching out to recruiters could be honestly like a total waste of time if you don't do it right. Not all recruiters are the same. There's a ton of differentiation between roles. So we're really going to chat about that and give you some examples of what you might want to do, some templates of how to email a recruiter, and who recruiters are, how to find them. And then one of the other things we'll touch on is that even if you do everything right, you go to Google, you pass all of the interviews, and I mean all of the interviews, you get a hire decision from a hiring committee, you still might not get hired for a role there. And this is super important to understand because a lot of times folks go through this process thinking that 100% no matter what, they will get the role, but it turns out that there's no slot available for them. So this is super important to get. A huge misconception, not just about Google, but about Fang in general. So we'll talk about this a ton today. All right, let's kick it off. 80% of hiring in Fang happens through sourcing, and Google is no exception to that. And it's really important that you understand that because most people who apply for Google apply literally by submitting an application online. And while that could be still effective, it's effective in a very small number of cases. So you are much more likely to get hit by lightning than you are, and God forbid that happens, but just for the sake of argument, than you are to get hired by applying somewhere online. And especially now in 2020, especially now with COVID, almost all of the applications that we see go through are people who are either actively sourced or getting in for referrals. And so one of the big pivots you really have to make mentally is you can't be a passive applicant anymore. You can't just fill out a few forms and hope that people will get back to you. Even if you have, written the game on how to game ATS, it still won't work for you. And this is really important. So we're going to start here in how Google recruiters find you. And then we'll talk a little bit about how they interview you and then how they hire you and level you. So let's take a look at where sourcing happens. Namely, for most folks, sourcing will happen in one of these kind of 4 areas. First, LinkedIn. Second, GitHub. If you're an engineer, there's a ton of technical recruiters looking for you. Then Behance, if you're a designer. Dribbble also. Folks are spending a ton of time prospecting there. And by saying folks, I mean recruiters. And lastly, referrals. So sourcing essentially means recruiters go out and find candidates they think would be a good fit for Google and invite them to apply. And this is a numbers game, so they typically try to source as many candidates as possible. And there are people at Google dedicated just for sourcing. They might look at people who applied, but they're likely to spend a lot more time in the discovery phase looking for people who did not apply for the job. And here's why. I want to give you kind of an empathy perspective of what recruiters experience. And this is a screenshot from LinkedIn Recruiter. Google uses this for sourcing, and then they export results into their own applicant tracking system that's homegrown. So for this particular role, there are 63,000 professionals that are available in a given geographic area. But you see there's also 4,500 job posts. And so if I'm a recruiter, what this means to me is that 4,500 other job posts that are competing with mine. And especially if I'm a recruiter at Google and I'm recruiting for things that are general. So if I'm recruiting for a software engineer, if I'm recruiting for a product manager, if I'm recruiting for data scientists, if I'm recruiting for design, I will be competing with a lot of other people for the same role, not just with Facebook and Amazon, but with companies of all sizes, because the roles are called the same. So there is a chance that the best candidates out there in the market never applied to my job at Google because they didn't see it. There's just so many other job posts competing for a candidate's attention. And this is a major reason why sourcing exists. Basically, to make sure that Google has access to the best pool of candidates and make sure that candidates, even if they don't see the Google job posting, are aware of the Google opportunity. Google wants the very, very best, and they know that the only way to do that is a combination between looking at applications and finding people. And with time, many FANG companies have discovered that looking for people or sourcing yields higher quality candidates than the people that apply. So this is kind of another big reason why sourcing is very, very mainstream in FANG. And in fact, the majority of folks get hired this way. And when people source you, they don't really look at your full LinkedIn profile. They don't really get a chance to kind of look at the timeline you're looking at when people are posting stuff. You look like a photo and headline to them. So this is an example of what a sourcing screen would look like. So it's really, really important that you understand the dynamics behind how a recruiter might find you, how exactly they're looking for you, what are the keywords they're using, what keywords do you want to have in your skills, how exactly do you surface in search when you do, and like what exactly is the recruiter experience. We don't really have time to dive into that today, but I just wanted to underline that because if you want to get hired by Google, there's really two things you need to do, and one of them is to optimize your LinkedIn, and the other one is to get a referral. So optimizing your LinkedIn is something that is easy, within your control. You could do it today after you get off this workshop, and this should be your priority number one. We have a free resource for this, so you could absolutely just take some time to go through these like 4 or 5 videos and pause them as you go along. So you could just make the edits to your profile, and then you could post in our LinkedIn community for a review, and someone from the community can give you some feedback on whether or not you're doing it right. So I'm going to share the link to that right now. So you could bookmark this. So when you click, it'll open the YouTube page, and essentially just save it, watch it afterwards, and just skip to whatever video would be most helpful to you based on how far along you are in the process. And then you could take a look at how other people are doing it too, because in the LinkedIn group, you'll see which profiles we've given good feedback to versus which profiles we've given kind of improvement feedback to. So kind of one resource for you to look at. All right, so let's take a look at the next thing you want to do. If you're a developer, then you really need to optimize your GitHub portfolio. Like, this is just not optional. So I don't have time to spend on this today either, but I just want to ping it as something that you have to do because recruiters will look at that. And your alternative is you don't have to share it if you don't want to, but if you do share your GitHub profile, like, it better be perfect. And I'm not saying go crazy and have like elaborate projects. I'm just saying do your housekeeping, do some basic stuff to make sure that you are really prominent for the right reasons to a recruiter. So this is a read later link as well. Feel free to bookmark it and read it. And then I'm putting together a kind of packet of stuff for designers to do and for product managers to do that I will release next week in some of these follow-up workshops. All right, so let's talk a little bit about your resume. So we've talked about how recruiters find you. And so let's say they found you already for one of the kind of ways that we talked about. Your resume at this point needs to be Google worthy because you've spent some effort optimizing your LinkedIn, really hustling for these referrals. So what does Google worthy actually mean? Well, I'm going to show you a resume of somebody who got hired at Google in a senior design role, so you could sort of see what exactly is on there, and we could talk about what's good about it and what isn't. So here's the example. This is a very, very minimalist resume, which is exactly what Google is looking for. And here's what's really great about it. First, there's always a link to portfolios or relevant work in a place where it's really easy to see and it stands out, which in our case here is at the very, very top. Make sure that these links are easy to access. If you're sending a PDF of your resume, make sure that they're actually hyperlinked and a recruiter can click on them. Don't make it so people have to retype things, because they simply won't. Next, when you list your education, make sure you list your formal education and respected certifications only. And we have a special workshop on how to deal with your resume, so you're more than welcome to pop into that. I'm just going to give you the highlights, and that is, not every credential is a good credential. If you are taking classes at like a Udemy or a Coursera, they could be a great value add to your resume if they show that you're taking classes that are complex or challenging, or classes that are really stretching your skill. But if you're taking things like Communication 101, that has no place on your resume, because it actually could paint you in an unfavorable light. It could say that you're maybe a poor communicator, or maybe something that you're not great at, and maybe communication is key for the role you're applying for. Your resume, your LinkedIn, your kind of online professional presence, this is your brand. And this will determine both what opportunities you have access to, and also how much you're going to get paid later on. So you're only going to list respected certifications here. When it comes to experience, your resume is not your life story, and it's really important that you only highlight relevant experience. As you can see, this person had 4 different jobs, but they only highlighted the last job that they were at. And the reason for that was, this is the most relevant one to the recruiter at Google. And this is how you want to approach your resume too. You can highlight as many jobs as you want. You can highlight 3 jobs, 4 jobs, but make sure the experience is relevant. If it isn't, this is a great example of how you can just collapse it and put your title in the years that you were there. And that's absolutely okay to do. There is no resume police that's going to tell you something it has to be on your resume. In fact, this is a document for you to sell yourself, and every single thing on there better point at how you're a good fit for a specific role. Recruiters are pattern matchers. They have to look at hundreds of people a day. And so if you don't fit neatly into a box, you'll just get passed. Make sure that you fit into the box that you're trying to apply for. And lastly, stop trying to game ATS. Just get out of the mindset that ATS does not work in 2020. The ATS was great in 2005. It just is not a thing that people do anymore, because most hiring, again, happens by sourcing. To optimize yourself for sourcing, you want to game your LinkedIn, not your resume. Your resume is going to be read by an actual person, and so just make it actionable for a person, not for a machine. And so what you want to do is list technical skills, not keywords. Things that you can do, or kind of skills that you have that would be desirable for the specific job. Again, we want to make sure everything here is pared down to what will sell you, or what will help the recruiter pattern match you, and not kind of high level, these are all the things that I can do. All of us have skills and abilities beyond what the specific job description might be asking for. This is not the place for it. This is the place to sell yourself for the specific job description. And a couple of questions that I see here on the side, so I'm just going to pause. Sarah's question is, does your CV have to be 1 page? Yes, it does. In some cases, you can attach an additional page of projects or accomplishments if you're very, very senior, but it should be 1 page, and no cheating, one-sided, not double-sided. There's no cover letters for FANG for Tahal's question, so cover letters are not something you need to be doing at all. So if you're doing that, please stop doing that. FANG does not read cover letters. We've spoken to a good dozen of Google recruiters to put these workshops together, and all of them told us they have not read a cover letter in the last like 5 years, so please stop. And then a couple of other questions. Whether it's important to put education first, even at a senior level, that's a great question, Tolu. And the reality is, it just depends on the situation. So in this case, if the person was applying for an interaction designer role, but they didn't have a very interaction design specific background, then putting their education first just highlighted that they have that skill set. So it's just more so of how you want to sell yourself and how you want to position yourself. Typically, if you're a recent graduate, you always want to put it on top. If you're not a recent graduate, you might want to strategically put it on top, like in this example, to just showcase a skill. The first thing a recruiter will see is interaction design, and if they're pattern matching for the interaction design role, that's just a shoo-in. All right, so now that we've looked at a resume, the next thing that you want to do is reach out to the right person. Because if you don't find the right recruiter or the right person to reach out to, you're just wasting your time. And Google is a massive organization. It's also an international company, right? And so not every person can refer you to every role. And not every recruiter is recruiting for every role. Recruiters get very specialized over the course of their career. And this is something that you definitely want to consider. It's really, really important. Why? Well, there's a couple of different kinds of recruiters. So let's talk about that for a moment. At Google, you have, and this is very broad, there's a ton of other kinds, but broadly, there's sourcers, and sourcers' job is just to find you. So you can think of them as, discoverers. They're the people who are looking for folks to put in the pipeline. They're the people who are hustling on LinkedIn, trying to find you and other candidates. They're the ones going on GitHub. They're the ones going on Dribble and Behance. So sourcers' entire job is to source, hence the name. So they're just looking for you. And they usually are given a number of roles to look for, and that's what they concentrate on. Coordinators, you'll see the title is usually a recruiting coordinator. Their job is, once the sourcer has found you, their job is to schedule you and coordinate between you, the sourcer, the recruiter, and anybody else internally who needs to meet you. So you can think of the recruiter, the coordinator, as the scheduler. So when you see the title recruiting coordinator, if you're trying to hit that person up for a referral or trying to ask them to look at your resume, you're wasting your time. Even though it says recruiting in the title, they're coordinating. Their job is to make a million, trillion people's different schedules and kind of other obligations fit so that the candidate can get hired. They're kind of expediters. And then the recruiter, so you could see things like technical recruiter, leadership recruiter, university recruiter. These are the people who actually do the screen, and they manage the process internally in the organization. So they're the ones who will first interview you. They're the ones who will put together your hiring packet, go to the hiring committee for you. They'll help you negotiate your salary when you're down to that point. So these are the folks that kind of are internal. So sourcers are external, looking for you. Recruiters are internal. They're just kind of coordinating everything in the company, and coordinators are in between. So if you reach out to a coordinator, again, no dice. If you reach out to a recruiter, they'll occasionally get back to you if they're recruiting for a very hard role. But chances are their obligation is to kind of run a ton of stuff internally. So you definitely don't want to reach out to them unless you have not been able to find the right sourcer. And even then, make sure you find people in the right company. So recruiters are specialized by team and by role. And this is crazy important to understand, because just because you have a recruiter at Google doesn't mean that they can help you. So let's say that I'm a recruiter for the operations team, and you're a designer or a product manager applying, or a data scientist. You're not in my org. Chances are I may not even be in the same org myself as all the other recruiters who are recruiting for these roles. I also have a ridiculous amount of quota to fill, ridiculous. And so if you reach out to me and you're not relevant to me, I'm just not going to reply to you. And this is what happens 99% of the time. So one of the main thing that you want to ensure when you're kind of really positioning to get sourced and really positioning to get discovered is that you find the recruiters who are responsible for the right team and the right role. So an example might be a team could be Google Assistant and a role could be engineer. A team could be Google Assistant and a role could be product manager. Sometimes when the teams are very, very big, a recruiter might specialize in just a role within a team, and sometimes they might be supporting a team. And occasionally, if you're just trying to find someone by role, then this is something that you could do as well. Here are some examples of what you might want to do. So at Candor, we started putting this together by reaching out to a ton of the people who we've helped negotiate for and saying, hey, who was your recruiter? And just kind of collecting this. And over time, we've collected like 6,000 of them. And it's not something we advertise openly, but things are just so crazy with COVID, we decided to publish this so you guys could sort of orient yourselves and find people. So this is what it looks like. You could find it on the Candor site. And when you click on a recruiter, it'll tell you what exactly they do when we have that data. And when we don't have that data, I would super, super appreciate your help. If you happen to know what these people do, and add that as a tip. Because ideally, we want for people to be able to go and find the recruiter in the company super easily. And again, a ton of them are already there, so you can look up recruiters. And for the ones that you know or for the ones that you're talking to, please add the information so everyone else can see it. And you could also see there's votes. So in some cases, people have come in and said, oh, well, this recruiter is like really looks out for me or is a fair negotiator. Or gives interview feedback, or maybe this person ghosted me. So you can also just like figure out what other people's experience has been with recruiters. And now we found the right recruiter. We have all of our ducks in a row. We really want to shoot to kill. We want to make sure this recruiter actually gets back to you when you do get a reply. So here's what you need to do. Here's an anatomy of how you get a recruiter to actually reply back. Here's an example. Hi, Jane. I'm interested in the assistant team at Google. Sorry, I forgot to type team. I have 4 years of experience working on similar products at Amazon. Attaching my info below. Can we schedule a 15-minute call this week? Let me explain to you why this works. First, you mention a specific team, and it's the team this recruiter is responsible for. And remember, you could just pop in here and get that. And the reason why it's important is because the recruiter, they want to make sure that you are actually looking for them, not for the recruiter on like the search team or for recruiter on the maps team. You're looking for them, the recruiter for the assistant team. So you immediately have their attention. Next, you want to tie in your experience. So saying something like, I have 4 years of experience working at similar products, making sure that you know that A is the right team and B, it's a team that you are relevant for as well. Make sure you make it very easy for the recruiter to look at your qualifications. So attach your resume below or attach a link to your GitHub or whatever you think really showcases how you're relevant for the specific team. So if you're a designer, don't put up your portfolio if you don't think it makes you relevant for the specific team. Instead, you might want to put in your resume. And then the last thing is have a very narrow, specific time window that you're asking for. And 15 minutes usually seems to hit the spot. You're essentially asking for a screen. And this 15 minutes will end up turning into your first interview at Google if you play your cards right. So this is what you should do. But again, this really won't work for you unless your LinkedIn looks good, unless you spend the time to actually work on your resume, and unless you're contextually reaching out to the right person. So all of these prerequisites need to be met. A lot of times I see like a lot of these kind of career type resources where it says, oh yeah, just write this and it'll be fine. Yeah, it'll be fine if you do the 7 other things you have to do before you write this. So don't forget to do the work. It really, really is important. And it's the difference between whether you're going to get a call back or no. And I'd like for you all to get a call back. So please, please, please put in the work. It's super important. And then I'm not going to cover this because it is like literally a 1-hour topic on its own. But if you do want to get referrals, which is the alternative to reaching out to recruiters directly, we have some resources on how to do that. Let's see if I put it in here, maybe. It's another like just free thing you could watch on YouTube. So here you go. You could click on it. It'll open a new page and you can bookmark it to watch after. And this is another thing where I broke it down in small videos so you don't have to sit there for like forever. You could just forward or you could skip between videos. And there's examples on how to write emails. So the last video has like 6 or 7 email examples of writing an email to someone you don't know versus writing an email to someone you do, reaching out to people cold, how to find people's contact information, how to download all your LinkedIn contacts and sift through them so you could see who works where, how to use your second degree network, like figuring out who from your university maybe works at these companies, or from the people you know, who did they know that you could ask for an intro to, so stuff like that. So spend some time there. I think it's a really good resource to get you started on referrals because that's the alternative to reaching out to recruiters. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about how Google's hiring committee works. After you have reached out to recruiters, you're going to start by getting a screen and then going for a series of interviews with them until they make a hiring decision. And before all of that, the most important thing you have to know about the Google hiring committee is that hiring decisions are made by consensus and not majority vote. That means that every person you're going to meet at Google is going to be equally important. There's no such thing as I did shitty at one of my interviews, but really great at all the others. It doesn't work that way. Consensus is really, really important, and there's a lot of things that Google puts in place to avoid bias and to build consensus. So I'll walk you through what these are. But chief among those things is a lot of us forget that the recruiter also has a say in the hiring decision. And this is a very easy advocate to make right off the bat. Treat your recruiters well from the very, very, very beginning. Because consensus means consensus, and the recruiter is also sitting at that table. So here's what a recruiter screen will look like. It's usually like a 15 to 20-minute call. It tends to be really informal. They'll ask you about your background. They'll ask if you specialize in something. Sometimes they'll ask you to describe a last project you worked on, what you're looking for, why specifically Google, things like that. It tends to go really fast. And the most important thing recruiters look for here is just your level of communication and also your scope. So one thing that you really want to kind of remember as we go through this is scope is super important for Google. And as I start talking about how hiring decisions get made, I'll unpack that a little bit more. But this is a behavioral interview. And even though it's informal, if you don't nail it, you just won't go forward. Most people do okay on this, but definitely spend some time practicing things like tell me about yourself and just talking about your work. It's something that you should be really comfortable doing to be able to pass. And what recruiters are looking for, even at this kind of very early stage, is Googliness. And that's just kind of a mix of attributes interpersonally that Google looks for. And we talk about this a ton, but a really good thing to reiterate is it's really, really important to understand that while companies will look for hard skills when they source you, Google will interview for soft skills when they found you already. So it's very important not to underestimate how big Googliness is for them. You could be the perfect candidate from a technical perspective and kind of really pass all the screens. But if you don't have this, people will routinely not get hired. So make sure you really internalize what's important to them, what attributes they look for, and you really are able to articulate how that relates to your experience. And then the recruiter decides if they want to move you forward past the screen. Typically, most folks who have reached this point of the screen, if the recruiter is interested enough in talking to you, a lot of times folks will move forward from here. And then the next couple of rounds are traditionally the video and on-site round. And obviously right now everything's a video round, but typically the next round is with two people from your profession. So it might be two designers or two product managers, two engineers, where you have two assignments to do. And the assignments will be different depending on your role. So next week, as we unpack specifically for each role what the interview process looks like, we're going to do things like interview questions that cover for each role, or just kind of types of interviews and what you do in each one, what examples. So tune in for that. And then the last stage, if you pass that, is what's called the on-site. And that typically is kind of a more in-depth interview. It includes a behavioral round, and it usually includes a technical round if you're like a PM or a designer. This is when that would come in. So one thing to remember is every single person throughout this process, they're responsible for giving you feedback. And interviewers at Google are people who are trained in what kind of quote unquote, the term for that is calibrated. So usually you can apply to be an interviewer, you go through some specialized training, and then you have to sit on multiple sessions as an observer. And then afterwards, you could start doing your own sessions, but then your ratings are calibrated to make sure that you're rating the same way that they want you to rate, so there's consistency. Everybody in these rounds gets asked the same interview questions. So the interview questions for senior people are not different from the interview questions for junior people. When you're on a manager ladder, you'll get asked questions for the manager ladder, but the difference between like M1 and M2 or D1 and D2, the questions will be the same. The expectation of how you answer them will be different. So on your ladder, don't expect that the questions will vary that much. So really, really important is, again, everybody's rating you. And the way that that works is they give you a score. And they also do super detailed written feedback. And when I say super detailed, like it's almost verbatim. So a lot of times when people are interviewing you, especially on video, you might feel like, oh, maybe I'm not doing well. Am I kind of hitting all the things that I want to hit? Stop trying to read people's facial expressions, like really de-emphasize that, because people are trying to put everything down in memory or to write down enough to be able to grade you afterwards, because they have really, really intense requirements for how detailed the feedback could be. In fact, if their feedback is not detailed enough, even if you have a good score, you could be asked to be re-interviewed because the interviewer's feedback wasn't good enough and the score therefore is invalid. So stop trying to really concentrate on people's expressions, really concentrate on your answer and the content you're delivering. And the scores range from 1 to 4. 4 is a strong hire and 1 is like a no hire. Typically, the way that that works is every round you'll get a score and detailed feedback. And so after the first round, if your scores are low, you won't proceed. If your scores are high, you will proceed. And if there's a big differentiation in your score, then they will look at the calibration of the interviewer. They'll look at, what is the person junior? How many interviews have they done? How do they rate people usually? So the interviewer is scrutinized just as much as you are. So essentially, if you don't get a high enough score, you won't proceed. And then if you pass all rounds, you get something called your packet put together for you. And this is the recruiter's responsibility. So they go out and put this together for you to present it to the hiring committee. And your packet is all of your performance put into one. So here you have things like your resume, you have things like your referral, you have things like your interview feedback, you have all sorts of stuff that the recruiter might have written down during the process, like any notes or kind of any feedback they got personally. So everything kind of goes into this one big thing. And this will go to the hiring committee to help them decide on your application. So it's super important to see that this is all that they'll see. There's not anything else that's going to the hiring committee. So for instance, if you have competing offers, if you have like any compensation related requests, none of this is something the hiring committee knows. So they don't evaluate you knowing that you have multiple interviews or multiple offers. They evaluate you just based on this information here. So let's talk a little bit about how reviews actually happen, because this is really, really important. So the recruiter will submit your packet usually 1 to 2 days, mostly 2 days prior to the committee meeting. Typically, 5 to 10 people will be reviewed in any single meeting. So the people usually from that week. And each member of the committee gets to review the assigned candidates before the meeting on their own. So they're not doing this as a group to begin with. They're doing this individually. And they're not talking to each other about it because they don't know who else is going to be on the committee. And the reason why this is done is to avoid bias, to make sure that independently, without knowing anything about you, without knowing anything about who else is on the committee, they kind of assign their feedback on what's going on. And so usually what they'll do is they'll take a few days to read through everything. They'll put comments, they'll highlight areas where they feel like the interview feedback really stood out to them, whether it's for a good reason or for a bad reason. And at the end, same as everyone before them, they're also going to give you a score. So you get a score from every interviewer, then you get a score from every person on the hiring committee who looks at your packet. And then there's a hiring committee meeting once everybody has scored you individually. So usually that's, again, a couple of days after your interview, but sometimes it could be longer if there's a lot of candidates going through the pipeline. And so when people meet several days later, what ends up happening is the recruiter is in the room if they're senior enough. If not, it's usually their manager, and they're facilitating the meeting. So they know every single thing that was said in that meeting. They usually put everybody on the screen because everybody submits their feedback electronically, and then they sort through the feedback from highest to lowest. And usually there'll be a few candidates that will be rated consistently high, and these are not ones that really need a lot of discussion, so they'll start there. And then they'll move on to the candidates where there was a lot of dissimilarity in scores. So maybe one person gave you a 3, another person gave you a 4, one person gave you a 1, another person gave you a 4. And they'll spend on these most time on these cases, ones that are kind of in the middle of the like average score. And they'll talk about every single rating and why it was assigned. So when they do that, a lot of times the ratings may change in the room, and they'll kind of question each other as well as question the interviewer. And it's not just kind of you that's being reviewed, it's also the interviewer's track record. So for instance, if everybody gave you a 4, but one person gave you a 1, they're going to pull up the track record of the person who gave you a 1. And this literally looks like a histogram or kind of like a stats package for every single person, or dashboard for every single interviewer there, so they can see if they consistently rate people high or low, kind of what questions they usually ask, or these typical questions everybody else asks, things like that. And essentially the committee themselves, they're folks who are kind of peers, so usually people at your level, folks who are managers at different levels, and usually at least one cross-functional member who can assess your partnership ability. And they're really looking at the feedback from the recruiter, the feedback from the behavioral questions that you might have answered earlier. And as I mentioned, your interviewer's track record is considered super, super heavily. It's something Google tracks and takes super seriously. So again, if your low scores are coming from someone with like a troubled record, or someone who's known to be like a hard interviewer, or maybe someone who's junior, you might get a second chance, but that's not common. And separately, they review each other's feedback as well. They criticize each other as well to arrive at a conclusion. But chances are, if you came into the room with low scores, it's really rare, if not impossible, that you would get a higher decision. If you had mixed scores, it's still feasible for you to get hired, depending on the discussion that happens in the room. But it's kind of like a low chance as well. And usually most of the time, the recruiter can give you a pretty good estimation of what your performance so far has been, because they also want to kind of move the process forward as fast as possible. And your file notes is something that is looked at super, super carefully. So many times if you're a developer, these notes will include the entire code or solution you presented, and this will be scrutinized in the meeting. These meetings tend to be obviously fairly long. So every single detail about you will be looked at very, very carefully to make sure the interviewer did their job well, and also to make sure they give you a fair shake. And then committees could be a little bit different depending on what role you're going for. So like, for instance, there's committees for different stuff. So people operations committees, they review like HR hires. There's sales committees for the sales hires. There's engineering committees for engineering hires and so forth. But usually for most folks, there's at least 5 people present. And this is super, super important to know, because it's not like just 1 or 2 people. It's a pretty good cross-section of folks. So let's talk a little bit about levels and ladders now that we've had a chance to cover how hiring decisions get made. So in this room, in addition to a hire, no hire decision, the committee is going to decide your level. And like I mentioned, everyone in a ladder gets asked the same questions, but sometimes people get assigned different levels. So let's talk a little bit about why. The hiring committee decides your level, and I want to be perfectly frank in saying that negotiating your level is extremely hard. It's something that we've done at Candor for people before, but it's harder to negotiate your level than it is to negotiate your salary. And typically, negotiating your level involves re-interviewing from scratch. So unless you really, really want to do that, then changing your level is typically not a great idea. So the ladder is your role, and the level is your scope or your seniority. And so these are 2 kind of different concepts that you want to understand because they're kind of distinct from each other. And so when you look at things like salary data, or when you just kind of try to decide for yourself what your career path would look like, this is really, really important. So Google has essentially separate tracks for individual contributors, known as ICs, and for managers. And broadly, this means engineers, for instance, have two ladders, a developer and a software engineering manager. And the difference is mainly time allocation. So developers still can manage others, but they're expected to spend the majority of their time managing themselves and contributing as an individual. And EMs, engineering managers, they're expected to spend 80% of their time managing people and maybe like 20% contributing. And so your ladder is really how you're evaluated when your performance review comes along. Performance reviews will focus on the expectation for your ladder. So for instance, being on the wrong ladder can really, really hurt your ability to hit your bonus, your ability to get promoted or to up level. So if you're like an engineering manager, but you spend all of your time coding, you probably should not be on that ladder. You should probably be on the IC ladder. And especially because the way that Google does promotions is very similar to how Goldman Sachs does promotions. And they do something called a lagging promotion. So you need to exemplify that you could work at the next level at least for 6 months before you get promoted. So if you're on the wrong ladder altogether, oof, that could be really, really painful to do. A little bit about ladders and levels and how to really think about them is the way that this is going to get assigned is not really based on how many years of experience you have or how senior you are. And you could be super senior where you are and still get a fairly junior level coming into Google. This is where scope really comes in. So a lot of times people who have like 20 years experience as an engineer, they don't get hired at all. And a lot of times people that have this level of experience are even more heavily scrutinized. Because if you don't increasingly work on larger and larger scope projects throughout your career, TLDR, Google's not interested in hiring you. And so if your scope is small, it doesn't matter if you have like 60 years of experience, you're still going to end up pretty low on the leveling and potentially even end up on an IC ladder, even if you're a manager, if you don't have the type of manager experience that Google is looking for that role. So here's how kind of levels generally work. I'll give you engineers for an example, but it's super relatable to other roles too. And I'll just do the Ls, so the individual contributors. I'm not going to go into the manager levels because I could spend like 10 days talking to you about levels essentially. So I've tried to contain myself. L2 is usually an intern. In this case, like a software engineering intern. So usually like senior year of a 4-year degree program. L3 is full-time, or that's kind of like the new grad level for grads that don't have previous experience. L4 is 1 to 5 years of industry experience. Sometimes high potential new grads or PhDs will get that. Usually if you have a couple of years of experience under your belt. And then higher than that, what are considered the more senior levels, let's go for those as well. So L5 is a senior software engineer. It's 6 to 9 years of industry experience. And this is the level most engineers are at internally at Google. So you're expected to be able to operate with very little direction. And you're also expected to handle fairly complex tasks on your own. L6 is staff software engineer. This is 9 years or more of experience. And again, all of these like years of experience, please don't translate them as, oh, I have this much on my resume, I should be good. That's not how that works. It's that many years of experience with the correct level of scope. So you might think that you have 10, but it could be that you have 2. So be super, super mindful of how scope plays into this. So it's not like how many years have I been an engineer, how many years have I been an engineer at a similar scope level. So 9 or more years for L6s. And this is like extremely strong interpersonal skills and abilities. It's fairly hard to get to L6. Many engineers will start managing way larger projects and maybe even teams at this point, even as an IC on the IC ladder. Promotion from L5 to L6 is a lot more exponential in nature. And it's rare that candidates get hired into an L6 externally. It definitely happens. We see a good amount of these at Candor, but it's much more rare. L7 is folks that are super rare. Usually, most recruiters can count those on one hand, the number of L7s they've hired in their career. And it's because it requires an extremely, extremely high understanding of projects of that scope. And also, a lot of times it will require sponsorship. So does L8. Anything L8 and above requires an executive sponsor. And it's really, really important to understand that, because a lot of times people think that they're a VP or a director where they are, so they can come in and be like an L7 at Google, and it's just not going to happen, because there's a lot of things that have to do with scope that really negate the years of experience you might have somewhere else. All right, so let's talk a little bit about leveling, just kind of the mechanics. So new grads, again, super straightforward. PhDs will usually be a 4 unless they have a ton of work experience or really narrow area of research that Google's really interested in. MBAs or MS or BA degrees with 0 experience will hit an L3. If you have experience, you'll usually hit an L4. So industry experience basically increases how much you can hit. And industry experience is counted based on your scope. So if you worked at like a bank or something for a year as an engineer, that's not going to count. You're still going to be like an L3 or L4 as a new grad. So your experience has to be relevant to Google or it's not going to be counted in. And then for everyone else who's not like a new grad, there's a couple of dimensions that are important to mention. So interview performance is a really important dimension, like we talked about. Everyone gets asked the same questions, but how you handle questions, especially around things like system design and more complex topics like that, is super, super important. For instance, for L3s and L4s, the main consideration would be algorithms and coding ability, but for L5, it would be more system design ability that's weighed heavily, and communication skills were going to be weighed very heavily for an L5. So you could be a really gifted engineer, but be a shit communicator or just not be great at system design, you'll get L4. It doesn't matter how many years of experience you have if you can't pass those two things. And then, for instance, L6, they'll judge on their ability to deliver impact, deal with significant degree of complexity. So the committee will consider not just your interview performance here, but they're also going to look at your past responsibilities. So a lot of the questions will be around the projects you manage, and specifically around how you manage people in those projects or how you manage sufficient complexity in that project. Your previous level matters sometimes, but not always. So if you are like at Amazon or at Facebook, the recruiter is really going to go crazy asking you about your level. You don't have to disclose that. It's not required. In fact, sometimes it's in your interest not to, because if you tell them a level, there's some preconceived notions. For instance, if you're at Amazon, you're moving to Google, you'll be down leveled sometimes. So if you tell them you're an L6, you might get an L5. Just because you're an L6 at Amazon, and they just have assumptions of people operating at those levels. So it's really, really important not to tell them your level if it might be a disadvantage for you. And realistically for Google, I would only tell them my level if I was at Facebook, because that's consistent, or at Netflix, because consistently in those situations, you can land very similar level. But from other companies, you typically will be down level because of scope. And scope and transferable skills are very similar. So if you are from a small organization, operating at Google is very, very different. So if you have no experience at larger projects, no experience in a matrix, or no experience doing similar things, you'll be aggressively down-leveled. Even if you have been an engineer for 20 years, there are situations where you pass the interview and it's just determined that you don't have sufficient scope. And it doesn't make sense to take an engineer who has 20 years and put him in an L4. So they just pass on you. Even though you've done every single thing right, you've interviewed right, you just haven't shown a lot of progression in your career. You haven't progressively tackled bigger problems. And it doesn't make sense to put you again in a junior role, so they just pass. This happens all the time, more frequently than you think, and it's one of the major reasons why people don't get hired at Google. It's the same for designers, it's the same for product managers. If you're a designer at a small company and you have not had a chance to handle like larger scope projects, you might get passed on if they don't feel like it makes sense for you to be at a lower level. And if you're a PM at a non-large tech company, chances are you won't be considered at all. It's really rare for a PM to go to Google with no experience from a large company or no like kind of more founder experience or strategy experience that they could translate in terms of scope. So this is really, really important to understand, because it is one of the main reasons why people get passed on. And the last kind of thing I want to tell you which people underestimate a ton, is you could do all of this, literally every single step we talked about. So get sourced, get interviewed, get hired, get a favorable hire decision, get leveled, sometimes even talk about your salary, and then you could still not get hired. It definitely is possible. Happens all the time too. And if you don't find a team match, you essentially won't get hired. For some roles, Google will put you in as a generalist, but for a ton of roles, they won't. So for instance, if you are an engineer and you're a certain level, they might go for the full interview with you and then decide that they're not filling those roles anymore, so you could get stalled. So right now, if you're an L5 engineer with Google, like honestly, good luck. We have some people that have been in team match for months. So months after they've been told they'll be hired, there's been no hire decision because they can't fit with a team. So team match is equally important as interviewing. And it's essentially you interviewing a second time, but now for a fit with a team. And this is extremely, extremely overlooked because not a lot of people obviously make it to the hiring decision at Google, but it's something that a candidate would deal with all the time. Helping people find a team match it's part of our salary negotiation packet. So some of the things that you want to understand is if you're a certain level, you can only match with teams that have that level open. So if you're like an L7, you can only match with teams that have an L7 position. All the other teams are not available for you. So it could be like 100 open positions at Google, but you can only match with 5. So this is a huge thing. And for some levels, Google has interviewed more people than there are available roles. And so there's a chance that you don't get matched with a team and you have to wait until a new role opens. And nobody can tell you how long it takes for a new role to open because it depends on how the business is doing and how fast the company is expanding. It depends on attrition, turnover. Recruiter can't really tell that. So sometimes you finish everything, there's just no team for you, and you just have to wait. And then even after you wait, you go out, you meet the manager, maybe you're not a fit, maybe they don't like you. You have to wait to meet another manager. So this could be a fairly lengthy process. And out of all the things, Google is super struggling with this on timing right now. Again, we have people stuck in this pipeline for months here at Candor. And we have a ton of insight into how to navigate it. So I can only imagine what's happening for folks that are doing this on their own. Teams your recruiter's filling is a big factor too. So your recruiter might not have full visibility over every team in the company. And it sounds silly because they should, but Google's massive. And there's also situations where the recruiter has more incentive to fill certain teams than others because remember, recruiters are highly specialized and sometimes they're specialized by team as well. So a good recruiter should tell you like, hey, I don't have anything for me, but let me look at another team. A shitty recruiter might not tell you that. They might just say there's nothing right now, let's wait, because you're a good candidate and they know a team will eventually come up and they've put in the work to find you. They don't want to pass you on. And so one of the things we do a ton at Candor is because we've helped so many people get hired at Google, we just reach out internally to see if our former clients can help us figure out which teams are hiring so we can match people faster or go negotiate their salaries faster as well. There's also internal hires. So you're not the only person interviewing. There's internal hires for a lot of the positions you're looking for at Google. And so you're sometimes competing against people internally in the role. And there might be a delay until they decide between you and an internal hire for certain positions. And there's also the massive variance of teams. There are teams at Google that are amazing. There are teams at Google that are pure shit. And which ones you end up on really matters for your career development and really, really matters for how you're viewed outside of the organization when you try to move to another thing. People often think that just because they worked at Google, they'll be able to walk across the street and get a job at Facebook. And that's just not true. Which team you work on and what product you work on to support has a massive impact on your mobility and also has a massive impact on your price and how much salary you can demand when you make these moves. So once you finish all of that and you hopefully find a team, you could negotiate your salary. And we have this guide on salary negotiation. I didn't include a resource for this, but you could just Google it on candor.co. So you could use this to sort of understand how all of these things converge when it comes to your pay. And then you could obviously reach out to us if you need help with that. That's what we do. Here's the guide. And you can sign up for more office hours. That's all I had for you today. So let me know if this is helpful. Feel free to sign up for more of these office hours. There's a ton coming up in the next couple of weeks. And it's always a pleasure to meet new folks and hopefully help you land a job that you really, really love. And where you could be super happy. So here's how to save your seat for these office hours. They're all free, but we limit capacity. So usually we want to make sure that people can get value. There's still opportunity to ask questions. So we limit how many folks can sign up for that reason. So let me take a look at just a couple of questions that you might have before I jump off here. So let me see. Daniel had a question of whether the onsite is done remotely. That's a great question, Daniel. Right now, all onsites are being done remotely. And in the past, even before COVID, Google's been super flexible with that. So you can absolutely do an onsite remotely. You just want to make sure you have the right equipment. So if you're a designer, you'll be asked to connect your phone to your laptop so you could do an app critique. If you're a product manager or an engineer, you will be asked to whiteboard. And so it is good to have some kind of setup at home where you can actually do that. Maybe a tablet that you can connect or even literally a whiteboard because the interviewers will want to see your whiteboarding skills. And this is happening remotely and in person too. So make sure you have the right setup if you're going to do that. Question by Dave. Oh, that's a really good question. So Dave went through the process about 5 years ago and was not hired. What kind of notes or scores from previous applications are likely to influence the new application? It's a great question. So realistically, when it comes to Google, they don't, let me just put this up so everybody could see it. When it comes to Google, they don't look at the feedback from past applications for your new application. The only exception is if you were marked as no hire. Sometimes people will do stuff that will just get them blacklisted, essentially. It's really rare in tech generally for folks to get blacklisted. It's called a URA, or unrequested hire. But if you get URA'd, then even if you reapply, it won't work. And things that can get you URA'd are things like saying discriminatory comments, offending the recruiter, doing something like that, something really, really drastic. So unless you've done something like that, it's absolutely fine to reapply. They will not put your old application in there as part of the hiring decision. Kim had a question regarding scope. Can you elaborate on the best way to convey prior scope for your resume and interview process? Scope is really based on the type of projects that you used to work on. So how big was the overall budget of your project or size of your project, or how many users did it impact, or how complex was the technology, or things like that. So just being very specific about the size of your work and the complexity of your work, rather than being specific about your accomplishments. A lot of times people think that the resume should just be like a hit list of here's all the things I have accomplished, but they forget that FANG companies, Facebook and Google specifically, they're looking for scope. So you should always have one anchor sentence in the very beginning of every job description that talks about the scope of your work. And then you could put accomplishments that are contextual to that. That's the biggest tip I could give you. And we have a resume workshop that's specifically focused at large tech like FANG. So you're welcome to pop into that. It's free. I'll post it probably next week. And we could talk more specifically about other tips of things that you might want to do. Let's see. Naveen had a great question. I'll tackle that one. Should you try to get more than one referral? Does that affect your chances? It's a great question. So it does not affect your chances if you get multiple referrals. It does not make a difference at Google. Google and Facebook both have teams that only deal with referrals. So when you're referred in, there's a separate recruiting team that deals with you that's different from the other recruiters. So they have a completely separate process. So it does not matter how many people refer you. You'll only get one call back. It does matter, though, that the person actually refers you. A lot of times people will say that they'll do it and they never do. So sometimes it helps to get 2 referrals if you don't know the person well and you just don't trust them to actually do that for you. Other than that, getting 1 referral is absolutely sufficient. Question from David. Is it possible they would blacklist you if you've already applied multiple times? You will not get blacklisted for applying multiple times. You will get blacklisted for doing things that are like irreconcilable, like I mentioned. It's giving discriminatory comments, showing very strong bias, things that would really make them feel like you're not a cultural fit. Otherwise, even if you did really bad in your interview, like you did technically bad or you gave bad answers, people learn and progress. So it's absolutely fine to interview again. You won't get blacklisted for interviewing poorly multiple times, but it's just less likely that they'll call you back if you consistently have interviewed bad and you have not shown progression or improvement in your interviews. All right, you guys, it's been a very, very good hour spending together with you. I have somewhere to run at 11, so I'm always running a bit late, so unfortunately I have to go. Hope you'll join me for some more office hours. Again, it's been my absolute pleasure to spend time with you, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. See you tomorrow. Bye.